I guess in the early 60s, she went to Newport. And, she performed for 30 or 40 people in a workshop, and Joan Baez, was performed for like 60,000, And Sarah came back and visited us in Illinois. We liked her, and she liked us, and I said to Sarah, who'd you meet there? Well, I met Glenn Orland, and I met Peter, Paul, and Mary, and I met Joan Baez, and I always liked Joan Baez, so I said, well, how did you like Joan Baez? And Sarah said, well, she was a nice young woman, and just let it go at that. And I wanted her to say more, and I said, well, what did you think about her? And Sarah reflected, and she said, if I had a little time with her, I think I could teach her to sing. And, we sort of were taken aback because no one knew Sarah. Joan Baez was world famous. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, she likes all our old Appalachian songs, but she sure can't sing them. And what, Sarah was just making some, she wasn't putting her down, it wasn't jealousy, it was just, this was a Appalachian woman whose ear told her that Joan's attempts at singing Appalachian songs, though beautiful in a popular sense, were stylistically far from the mark. That is, just the nuances weren't there, the inflection wasn't there. In terms of music, Sarah's a melismatic singer, just draws the lines out. And Joan compressed it and on and on. And also Sarah sings from up here and Joan sang from down here. Yeah, on and on and on and on. But it never entered Sarah's mind that she would have to like Joan singing, though she thought Joan was really a nice, sweet, friendly young woman. But how do you deal with that when the judgment of life, then there were 50 million Americans, or 60 or 80 million Americans who would have put Joan Baez as the top singer in the country.
Well, I think that's the Kingston Trio. That's Peter, Paul, and Mary. The people who attained great commercial success did it by homogenizing.
Yeah,
they turned it into a palatable form
of palatable pop music.
Yeah, and it's not to Peter, Paul, and Mary are very pleasant to listen to, and a lot of people say they were always there for the right causes.
Sure. Well, that's why
they're New Yorkers.
I've always distinguished their politics from their music.
Sure.
But you have to remember that many Americans didn't, that they equated progressive politics with folk music. And then those of us who used to say, but folk music, see, a folk song intrinsically is neither progressive nor reactionary. Right. Folk songs cover the range of human experience. So you have songs that are Calvinistic, you have songs that are fatalistic, you have songs that are idealistic. Just if it's human, it'll eventually show up in a folk song. And the interesting thing is that the progressive aura, I insist, it stayed with brothers right to the end of the Kingston Trio influence, where you had the Brothers Four, and you had all kinds of folk groups, almost mass-produced. I think there was still a lingering association of their sounds to progressive politics. And I now one of the interesting things is, though, when rock came in after the Byrds and other American rock groups began, somehow Weaver's folk music clung to popular front notions of progressivism or liberalism, but many rock enthusiasts thought of themselves as cultural revolutionists. not so much not revolutionists at the barricades, but I had a professor friend at Texas, David Perry, who hated folk music but loved rock, and he was into it was drugs, sex, and rock and roll. It was a sexual revolution, a lot of drugs, and he saw. Now he was always at odds with his politically radical friends. There was a philosophy professor, Kellner, I think, was a student of Marcuse, and Perry they didn't like each other. That is, the Marxists had a more disciplined or party-oriented or a structured sense of socialism. And he thought of David Perry as a kind of an anarchist. Mm-hmm. So I think but some people didn't, that was too subtle a distinction. That is, folk music was progressive, rock and roll was progressive, just sort of everything was, I often wonder about people like that, whether they ever heard any music that was right, that wasn't left of center. That is maybe just to perform your own music by definition is a kind of a liberating or progressive act. But I could never believe that because I was too politically developed, so I would make judgments on the ideology that shored up the song, whether the performer could articulate it or not.
What was you touched on this a little bit in your Joan Baez anecdote, and it's something I'm curious about. As a consequence of the folk boom and the Kingston Trio, you had the organizers of the festivals and the campus folk clubs finding people like your friend Sarah Gunning, finding John Hurt, finding Frank Prophet is his name.
I'll get some of my articles.
Bringing these people up to Boston, to New York City, putting them on MacDougal Street, and I'm interested in what the reaction or the adaptability of the singers was to this, how the audience reacted to them when they had them.
Yeah.
Norm Cohen in the booklet, which you helped with, I saw your name in there. He had a couple of little anecdotes in there about one guy, cursing the audience out or telling them you're just clapping because I'm old, and another guy went back to North Carolina with a marijuana planting.
Well, of course. Look, there are many. The people to interview there. If you go to Chicago, there's a Flying Fish Company with Bruce Kaplan, and he comes out of the University of Chicago Folklore Society. They had, I think, 25 years of starting in the 59 or 60 of tradition-oriented festivals. Later, or at some point, a fellow named Neil Rosenberg, who's now he wrote the book. He's at Newfoundland. He's editing the book on the folk song revival. That's accepted at the University of Illinois Press. And I've written.
It's articles.
It's a series. Ken may have an article in it.
Yeah.
I have an article in it, which I'll get at some point. I'll get the galleys, and I'll Xerox it for you. It's on the Campus Folk Song Club, and I answered some of those questions. That before the Kingston Trio, that is, I've already indicated that, say, Robert Winslow Gordon and some of his peers had, in effect, sang traditional folk songs in the faculty grade at Berkeley as early as 23, 24 with Haywire Mac and so on. That went on. John Jacob Niles performed at Harvard or Princeton, I think, in 1927. John Lomax sang cowboy songs on the academic circuit. That is, there has been some performance of folk song on the American campus at least since 1910, if not earlier. And we know some of the people. And I think at University of Chicago, like Tam Pierce and Carl Sandburg and so on. Wherever you can document it, it's there. So, to me, one of the differences in the 50s and 60s, perhaps in the earlier campus appearance, it might be a collector or qualified performer or someone who had made some records who would come in as a guest and do concerts. But I'm not certain that it spread down so that great numbers of undergraduates began performing. But at least in the 50s, in folk song clubs all over the country, the notion was for students to perform. And students then, the moment they started performing, they internalized this aesthetic choice that we're making. That is, after your first few lessons, you approached a watershed. Do I sound like John Jacob, before the King, John Jacob Niles, who's a concert singer, or do I sound like Aunt Molly Jackson, who's a traditional singer? The Library of Congress field recordings were first issued in commercial form, that is, for sale, about 1940. 40, I think. Alan Lomax put out on 78 some field recordings. With the availability, before records, if you learned your folk song from a Carl Sandburg's collection, or a Schirmer collection, or a Fisher, piano collection, you had a choice on how to interpret it. Even, that is, the notation might be classical or it might be authentic, but you still internalized it. But after field recordings, in contrast to commercial recordings, but after field recordings were sold commercially after 1940, whether you could read music or not, you could hear the authentic style, and you could learn from the records, as many young people did. The hard question is, why did some young people turn to authentic style or traditional style? And that's one of the $64,000 questions, but always answer it in terms of I reiterate here, some people in growing need to tie into tested forms or antique forms. Those forms certify for some young people a tie to the past, a stability, an anchor against family changes, a serenity. I mean, different words are used to justify or explain an affection for old forms, but there, never has been a generation in which some people have not had that feeling, and apparently it's constant in the Muslim countries today. I hope this doesn't seem as a digression, but look at the tension in Algeria, say, between middle-class women who want to be modern and the mostly young men who are unemployed who become fundamentalists. But, whether do they have fundamentalist feelings that tie into their insecurities, sexual equality, or they simply made redundant as the society is industrialized, and then the Muslim Brotherhood exploits their feeling of discontent. But there you see, you get a battle of the sexes, a battle between French and Algerian tongues, a battle between agnosticism and Muslim fundamentalism. But it's important to understand that there is always on the part of some people a personal and social need to cling to old forms. And it manifests itself in the case of folk music with often aesthetically, without knowing why, like Mike Seeger just likes those old sounds.
Right.
But if you psychoanalyzed him, there has to be some relationship to a second marriage. That is, there's some dissonance between siblings when parents are divorced. It has to be something about a place in the family hierarchy. You know, that if you're third born or fourth born or seventh born, at any rate, he exemplifies an aesthetic response to old time music. But this was happening all over the country. I'm not to millions of people, but at least to thousands, so that on every campus in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when young people and students encountered folk music, they had choices between its popular form or pablum form, its authentic or traditional or ethnic form. Now, technology keeps advancing. 78s become LPs, cassettes come in, TV comes in. Every technical advance broadens the accessibility of then esoteric forms. See, like when I started listening to records, I'm 74 now, so I started listening to records in the 1920s, 25, 26, 27, radio and records. Western, cowboy and hillbilly records. I grew up in California, so I didn't hear much black music, but Western music was available. So from childhood, I had a model in my ear. I had an oral model of cowboy music. And by the time I was 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and I extended from cowboy music to Appalachian music. So when I heard the Carter family or Uncle Dave, I simply assimilated that into my notion of cowboy music. By the time I was in World War II, I was in the Navy, I was in boot camp in the South, and I served with Southerners, and I began to hear Appalachian speech. As a war worker, I could hear Okie speech. That is, I'm just describing myself, but this happened to other people. The experiences built on... I don't know why I liked cowboy music when I was a little boy, but I did. And then all the experiences built on it. By the time I was teaching at the University of Illinois, I had substantial knowledge about folk song from books, from records, from film. I could talk about it, I could think about it, but I wasn't alone. Literally, 2 students, one the son of an accounting professor, that'd be upper middle class, right? The other the son of a executive at Motorola, one of the big Chicago capitalist big firms. These 2 youngsters, they were wearing Eisenhower jackets and sandals and smoking pot. They were, probably rebelling against their families. But they went to the University of Chicago Festival around 60 or 61, the first one, which was very tradition-oriented. That means there were already enough students at Chicago to have enough money to know about Bill Monroe or Sleepy John Estes. How did they know that? Because discographers had talked about their recordings, that there are certain key people who traveled in the South. Okay, so these two guys, Dick and Vic, that rhymes, they had gone to the University of Chicago festival. They heard some of these traditional performers. They came, there had been a folklore, folk song, folk dance club at Illinois, Illini, something, but it was Weaver's influence. These two guys didn't want to, it was a conscious move. They didn't want to be in that club. So they came, literally walked into my office 2 or 3 weeks after the festival. They hadn't known me, but I had been an MC up there. And therefore I established my credentials as knowing something about traditional music. And they asked me if I would be the faculty advisor to a newly formed campus folk song club. Well, I said okay, and I had worked on the waterfront here. I'd been in a union. I had a pretty good sense of organization, so I helped them start a really good club. Well, we put on some concerts. We made some money. We brought Latin Scruggs. We brought the Stoneman family. Over a period of 10 years, I think we brought 60 traditional performers. Now, how did these kids operate? There were fraternity boys all over our campus and sorority girls. Some would come to the folk song club. They had like open sings every other Friday night, and concerts and workshops. And the folk song club students, though they wore proletarian garb, they were really at one level, and though they were liberal and revolutionary, they were also elitist, as many young radicals are, because they really rejected when fraternity kids came in and did their Kingston Trio imitations, these campus folk song club kids were really, they put them down, they were mean, Well, at any rate, once you reinforce your friends' values, you sneer, you exclude them from the program. But here's an interesting thing. In that period, the university had something called Star Course. Most universities have a campus star series or, entertainment series. And they brought Joan Baez, they brought other big stars. Eventually they built a big flying saucer,
Oh, really?
at Illinois, basketball thing. They could get thousands of people. Oh, they had Simon and Garfunkel later and so on. Now they got thousands of people to their concerts, and we might get hundreds.
Yeah.
So, but we were, in that sense, our aesthetic purity compensated for our small numbers.
I was waiting for that word to emerge.
Yeah,
purity.
We felt superior.
Sure.
Yeah.
We felt that they were, different terms, elitists. Some elitists are into avant-garde film. Some are into avant-garde poetry or music. Our youngsters were elitists, but it's different. But they built their elitism on an affinity with the common man. So I had a lot of experience. That's how I got to know the folk song revival well, but from the perspective of tradition-oriented students fighting. Here's where some of it came together. I liked them in their hostility to the big university and mass culture. I helped them define the university in political terms. But not like the free speech fights at Berkeley. And later, when the free speech fights, reached Illinois, by then, of course, some of our youngsters went over to radical politics, and in fact, this Dick Kennard got himself, whose daddy, owned Motorola or something. He did get a good camera, and he was influenced by someone. He did an experimental film. I don't want to embarrass you or myself, but it was sort of like one guy did a film in that period in our club. It looked like water blobs falling on. He took a half hour of photos of things like sort of expanding, shapes. It was something like a light show.
Okay.
Now this kid, I'll tell you what he did. He filmed a sexual act of I don't know how to describe it, of oral sex of a man and a woman, or of two students, and then to sort of break the graphic blow-by-blow description of it, he speeded up the camera, and then every once in a while he'd slow it down. So it's something sometimes on modern TV advertisements where they just show you a second of a sexy shot.
Right.
Well, he did that for a half hour. Now, he was one of the two founders of the Folk Song Club, but this is 10 years later.
Uh-huh.
So he moved from folk song to avant-garde pornography. And where he ended up, heaven only knows. This other guy, Vic, he is the accountant's son. He ended up as a photographer in the Duke University Hospital, because he was, these were bright students, they were, some dropped out, but they were all competent. I mean, they could master folk song styles. These kids were bright. They'd go out this was in central Illinois, they'd be at the Greyhound bus station, and they'd see some guy with a guitar, and they'd bring him to the, they could find traditional performers, and they scorned the revival. See, we never invited Tom Paxton or Phil Oakes or any of those people to our campus folk song club. They were invited by Star Course. And see, though they saw themselves as progressive, we saw them as instruments of mass culture. So all through the folk song revival, this tension existed, and I wrote about it, what tradition meant to us. I'll give you a copy of it. An article will come out soon. But we use tradition as a talisman. I mean, tradition for us meant in touch with common people, in touch with our roots, in touch with reality. And we saw it as a very an opening, creative force, and going out to discover people and bring them to the. Before Doc Watson was famous, we brought him to our campus for the price of a Greyhound bus ticket and $100. But you had a circuit then. I discovered Glenn Orland, the cowboy singer, and we just saw him on television recently. And I'll tell you that anecdote. People come out of once an interest expresses itself in traditional performance, the venue is all over. Coffee houses, concerts, church groups. So Glenn was living in the Ozarks, and he went to a coffee house in Memphis, and he composed a good song. It's on his first record about going to the coffee house and looking like a cowboy, and I think they wanted him to do something like a Dylan song, and they said something like, "You're dressed like a cowboy, don't you know any protest songs?" And it was a real. If you could get him to do that, it would sum up a traditionalist. It's on his first record called The Hell. Do you know a woman in San Francisco named Faith Petrick.
Oh, we have.
We
know
have,
of her.
She has about 1,000 records.
We know of her. We've
Yeah.
listened to her
You
record.
should-
I want to call her. Yeah,
if
we've
you
got
get-
a number.
If you get Glenn Orland's first record, The Hellbound Train, he recorded that. And it's an early. It would be a perfect song for your thing. And
that does sound, yeah.
and then he says, I'll make up a protest song for you right on the spot, and it's really a satire. At any rate, some people in Eureka Springs, that's in Arkansas, they had a festival. See, you had regional celebrations, Paul Bunyan Day, Pioneer Day, you had Sacred Harp singing. These things have been going on forever. Cowboys sang at rodeos, Okay, so Glenn was invited to this Eureka Springs festival because it was near his home. Each performer could do 2 pieces. In other words, in the Ozarks, by then, this was 62, I think, there was enough interaction between... Remember I kept saying these vertical things?
Yes.
The revival touches the traditional performers and vice versa. So Glenn sang, I remember distinctly, he sang a hog driver's song. It's an Appalachian song he'd learned from someone, like a Joan Baez type of record, and he sang a Woody Guthrie song. But there he was in boots, Levi's, white shirt, Stetson hat, looked like a cowboy. So I went up to him afterwards. He didn't know me. And I said, well, you're dressed like a cowboy. How come you didn't sing any cowboy songs? And he said, well, they don't like them at these festivals. I had to sing 2 folk songs. That is, he had already tailored his repertoire to his expectation, and one was an Appalachian folk song, but not one indigenous to him. The other was like a Guthrie song.
I've heard that in other contexts. I remember reading an anecdote about one of the Delta blues singers who would, when he'd perform at house parties down in the Delta, they plugged in their guitars.
Sure,
In the 60s. People
sure.
wanted to dance. They wanted to
Right.
hear electric music.
But when he goes
They
to
were brought up to
Newport...
the northern
Right,
college
of course,
campuses.
sure.
He had to play an acoustic guitar
Sure,
because people
sure.
thought it was more authentic.
Right. Well, those are how the interactions work out. How are people supposed to comport across cultural barriers and across? That's why I made that point. This started when white men landed at Plymouth Rock, and when black slaves landed at Jamestown. That is, as people interact and borrow from each other. At any rate, back to Glen Orland. So I said, well, kind of challenging. Well, do you know any cowboy songs? In other words, are you authentic or not? He said, I know a few, because he didn't know me, And I said, well, I'd like to hear you sing some later. He said, well, maybe I'll get a chance. And that night, we went up on a hillside, kind of a little gazebo, to get away from the crowd. And some of the deep fans were there and performing. And then Glenn's turn came, and he said, I've been asked by some guy I don't know to do a cowboy song. There maybe were about 20 people on the hillside, and he sang The Hellbound Train. I don't know if you know that. It's a long ballad about a cowboy gets drunk, falls asleep in a bar, dreams that he's on a hellbound train. The devil is the engineer, they're going to hell, and the crew is made up of sinners and usurers and brothel madams and on and on and on, and then he accelerates the guitar, and it's faster and faster and faster. And just before they get there, he wakes up in a terrible sweat, and it's all a dream, and then he swears off of drinking. It's a great, great American ballad, and he performed it flawlessly. It was a moment of epiphany. Every collector has great moments when you hear a traditional cowboy singing a rare cowboy ballad in great style. I was with 2 or 3 friends, and we just then and there fell in love with Glenn, and we said, you've got to come up and sing for our college contest. for 2, and I set up 3 college concerts for him. He'd sung in a coffee house, but I said, what'll I sing? I said, just sing cowboy songs, you know. He said, okay, because he knew hundreds, and he started at Southern Illinois, Carbondale, closest to his house, and he did 2 hours worth of cowboy songs. Maybe he had 40 or 50 people in the audience. And I jotted all the songs down. I didn't interfere in any way. And then I said, when you come to Illinois, which was like the next night, I said, I'd like you to do the same songs, but in a different order. And he said, sure. I mean, no sweat. I wasn't making him learn a new song or give up his acoustical guitar or anything. He said, what order? I said, well, I'll just jot them down for you. He said, okay. And we had a shirt. You know, when the Chinese used to do shirts, they put them in a cardboard. He just took out a white shirt cardboard and put the songs in order, and then he put it down in front of his microphone. He didn't tell anyone, but it really made no difference to him, but it made a lot of difference to me, because what I did, I started with a dramatic number to catch the audience attention, then the slow numbers and a fast number before the intermission, repeated it, but ended with it's kind of a gospel song, called a religious song. And he asked me later, how did I know that order? And I said, well, you know, when you listen to a lot of concerts, you get some sense of structure. Structure wasn't a word. He's bright, but it wasn't in his vocabulary. And I asked him, how did you choose your order at Carbondale? He said, oh, I just sung them as they came into my mind. He said, I didn't know there was supposed to be any order. So that's, you know, the interaction isn't always one of imposing new codes. And they learn. And by the way, they had this television program, which we caught recently, a big concert at Louisville, emceed by Roger Rosenblatt. And he referred to that anecdote. He said, yeah, I met this guy Archie. Hello?